Hi, I'm Tamara Slade. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I teach in LA Unified School District, and I teach first and second grade at a school that is about 80% Black, and the other 20% is primarily Latinx. So I'm going to just kind of do just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about my unit design and the planning process, and then I'm going to just kind of give tips for implementation. So let's get started. So when thinking about how I'm going to design a unit, teach certain subjects, I always start with the standards. And because I'm in LA, I am using the California Social Studies framework. And because I was, the 1-2 combo that I was teaching was mostly second graders. And so that was like, I knew that I needed to take a look at the second grade framework, especially. And one thing that I really appreciated about it was this part here where it says, what makes someone heroic and who are some people who have made a difference in our lives. And I really liked that because I felt like it could give me flexibility, you know, with the framework, and I could really make it more responsive. And then, like I said earlier, just that flexibility allows me to sort of make sure that my students are culturally competent in the global society that we live in. And then one thing that I also noticed when I was looking at the standards was down here, you can see, I have to move my, it says, under the families today and the past, it says that immigrant families, families with lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender parents and their children, families of color, etc. And that part was really powerful for me because not only am I protected by teaching these topics, but I'm expected to be teaching these topics. And even if your state doesn't have this, it's not a reason not to, but I would look into your standards. I know that queer history is available in New Jersey and Illinois and Colorado, and you're expected to teach it in those states. So I highly recommend looking into that. And if that's not the case, I also encourage you to join groups that probably already exist in your state that are trying to change that. Yeah. And then I also wanted to talk about how as educators, it's our job really to be interpreting and using the standards, right? And so the way we might interpret the standards as social justice educators and ethnic studies teachers might be different than the textbook company, right? So I also looked at the first grade standards, right? Because I was teaching a 1-2 combo. And one of the standards that really stood out to me was, how is our life different from those who lived in the past, and how is it the same? Now, a textbook company might interpret that as like innovations, right? And they might see that as like, oh, well, back in the day, people used to live by candlelight, and now we have light bulbs. But I see that and I think civil rights. That's a huge difference, right? How life is different. And so that might not be what the textbook company has in the book. And so as educators, if we're creating our own like curriculum and designing this, we can incorporate these topics. So also now looking at kindergarten, another one that I was thinking about how it might be interpreted differently for a social justice educator versus a textbook company would be the question here where it says, what does it mean to be an American? Now, a textbook company might think that a piece of paper tells you that you're a citizen and that means you're an American, and that's that. Whereas me as a social justice educator, I'm thinking from a more inclusive perspective of undocumented people. And I might also be thinking about situations like Puerto Rico, for example, being essentially in this weird limbo where they're getting taxation from the United States, but without representation. And so like, are they American? And that being like something that we're discussing and questioning. And I don't know if that would necessarily be in the typical textbook, right? So I am going to move on. So now I have the standards, right? And I'm going to use those standards as kind of like this shield of protection because I'm anticipating there may be pushback because of the world that we live in, right? And so I'm also thinking how I want to be integrating ethnic studies, not into like just like my social studies block, but into everything, right? And so I'm going to be doing that with reading, writing, science, math, art, etc., right? And so some ways that I've done that and integrated it really like organically is in my readers and writers workshop. So you can see up here how I have a bunch of books about folks of color throughout history and some actually current. Like you can see Steph Curry's up there. Folks, and that was all done in our trimester 2 nonfiction unit. And so it can really be easily integrated, these kinds of topics. And then down here, I want to talk about how I incorporated that in writing. So a little bit of background on this letter that my students wrote was after George Floyd was murdered, I felt the need to just do a community circle with my students. And in community circle, the kids brought up George Floyd and how he was murdered, not me. And it was more than half of my class ended up wanting to talk about it in circle because it was like weighing on them. And so they really initiated this letter writing idea. And because, you know, we've been talking about power throughout the year because that ended up being what my unit was developed into. And this is kind of what came of it, which is great because initially, before a pandemic happened, I wanted to end it like opinion writing on a change you want to see in the world and kind of guiding them in the social justice lens area. And so this letter is entirely like this small group that wanted to do this and I worked with, it's entirely their words. I did not add anything to it. And all I did was just type it out. And then we focus on revising and editing it, right? So let's just read some of the powerful lines from my students because I'm really proud of my babies. So it says, Black and brown lives matter as much as white lives. I feel sad and disappointed because George said he could not breathe many times. I don't think putting in a curfew was fair because people were not allowed to peacefully protest this injustice. And so we sent this to our governor and signed our names and whatnot. All right. So I have the standards. I'm realizing I want to talk about power and people of power and words of power. And so the guiding questions that I used were how do people use their power? What is power? What can it be? And so I really like to start with Frida Kahlo because this is like a less obvious idea of what power is. Right? Her power is her art. And I also like starting with Frida, you know, because it's easy, right? At the beginning of the year, we're doing identity work and self-portraits and things like that. And also September, Hispanic Heritage Month, October, Disability Awareness Month. So it just is like a perfect way to kind of start things off. And then also her identity is really great because she's just, there's so much intersectionality to just discuss there. And which means that there's lots of entry points for students to be able to connect with her. So for example, right, she's mixed in many ways. So she's white and Latinx, right? She is German and Mexican. She's Jewish and Catholic. She's bisexual and she had a disability that she dealt with. And that all is evident in her art. And so it just allows for a lot of rich discussions. So now, like I have the idea, I'm gonna be repeating kind of this like, what's Blake's power and how do they use it throughout the year? And now I'm thinking like, how am I gonna cover everything, right? Like, oh my gosh, there's so many things I wanna talk about. And so one way that I kind of figured out like what I wanted to do was to kind of organize it in this way, just by like looking at the different months and celebrations. But I wanted to make sure that I was going beyond heroes and holidays. So when I'm teaching about a particular person, I am making sure that I'm giving context to them and the historical events that are going on at the time, right? And so I'm making sure also that I am, so one thing I also like about this is that it gives me a focus, but then I'm also teaching all these topics all year. So for example, you can see August is Muslim Appreciation and Awareness Month, right? We're only in school for 2 weeks. That's not a lot of time. I'm not going to just spend those 2 weeks just that and then never teaching it again. I'm teaching it in other areas, right? So in September, I'm talking about Islamophobia and 9/11. And then let's see what's next. January, in January, I like to do like an MLK, Malcolm X compare and contrast. And then so Malcolm X's Muslim identity really gets brought up there. And so I'm touching on it then. And then you can see in April, there's also Arab American Heritage Month. And so some Arab Americans are Muslim. And so that is something that I'm now also talking about again. And then depending on the calendar year, the holy month of Ramadan can be in May or June. And so then I'm talking about it again, right? And so again, I want to emphasize that even though I have focus areas and periods, I am also making sure I'm just making these thoughtful connections and cross-cutting and connecting themes throughout history all year. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is, sorry, I need a drink of water, is being resourceful. So I'm using read alouds, Newsy LA, vocabulary, brain pop. I'm always looking. That's how I ended up coming up with my social justice vocabulary and Zootopia lesson. I was just watching Zootopia over winter break, and I just had this idea of like, oh wow, there's so much to talk about here. I can start using some of this vocabulary to teach my students. I use Mulan and gender stereotypes. Blackish and Mixedish have really good clips, so I've been like keeping notes on my phone, and I really want to use that next year. I also recommend a resource I just found out about is the Library of Congress. They have really good primary source documents, so I'm beefing up my unit for next year. And then my advice is also just inform yourself. So these are some books I recommend. If you're like me and didn't get that, you didn't get ethnic studies in your K through 12 or even in your college education, then this is going to be really important for informing your work. And then the other thing I want to talk about is just mapping assets in the community. So there are a lot of assets in the community that we can rely on. And so one of them I'm going to talk about right now is what you can see up here is Chloe of Chloe Cares. She's a child philanthropist, came to our school. So you can see she's sitting here in the class. One of the amazing second grade teachers that I work with, a connection with Chloe of Chloe Cares, few years, or maybe more than a few years back. And so ever since then, she comes every year to visit my school. And it's really powerful for us to use like this to kind of teach the kids like an important lesson, because they're seeing someone that looks like them. They're seeing someone who's from their community. And when she started her work, she was a second grader like them. And so it's really exciting for them, and it makes it really real. And so let's see here. So let's see what they wrote for what is Chloe's power and how did she use it. So it says, Chloe's power was helping the homeless. Her voice was her power, her heart. Chloe's power was saving people's lives and saving water. And you can see that's like referencing her work in Ghana with water projects there. So now I wanted to talk about, so I was talking a little bit about my Powerful People unit, and now I want to talk a little bit about my Powerful Words unit, because they're kind of happening in parallel. And so, let's see, what did I want to tell y'all about that? So I wanted to talk about how words are really powerful, right? If you can name something, then you can talk about it a lot more easily. And so, and it also allows, when they have the words and the vocabulary, it gives them an elevated analysis of history, right? And so I usually start off with the idea of like we don't put people in boxes. And then that ends up being like, well, that really just means we don't stereotype people. And then I kind of introduce, you can see here, like prejudice versus an ism, like sexism or racism, and how they're different. And this stuff works. So for example, I had a parent email my principal saying how cool it was that she was having a discussion with her husband about sexism, and my student, her child, knew exactly what that was and could talk about it. And then I had another parent reach out to me and message me telling me that her child was able to identify a microaggression when they were sitting in the movie theater watching Smallfoot. And it just made me really proud. And it's like, this is evidence that first and second graders really do understand this, and they can apply it to their lives, and they are experiencing it in life. And so naming it is important. So I wanted to give you an example of that, how little kids can learn really, really big words. And so this read aloud that we did, it's called Unstoppable. It's about Jim Thorpe, who is a Native American Indian. And during the time that he lived, Native American Indians were essentially kidnapped by the US government and forced into American Indian boarding schools for forced assimilation, and really the intention is deculturalization. And so I broke down some of those words for them, and let's see kind of some of the answers. So, should anyone be forced to assimilate to American culture? Nobody should be forced. How is deculturalization used? What do you think about it? Well, I think that they should never allow them to cut people's hair and burn their clothes. And that's really referencing what's happening on this page of the book, right? So the kids are able to understand what's going on and identify these historical events. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is when it comes to implementing the Powerful People unit, Google is your friend. That is how I found out about Jim Thorpe. I didn't know who he was until I started Googling and really figuring out who do I want to talk about in November. And my other advice is to really balance activists and representation. And so I don't go and my goal isn't to teach my students sob stories, right, about marginalized communities. I am always doing it through the lens of power, of resistance, of resilience, and I'm trying to keep it positive, right? Because those stories do exist, and that's important. But I also, what I mean by representation is that I really want to celebrate excellence, because excellence is a form of resistance for marginalized communities. And so talking about authors, inventors, creatives, athletes is important too. And my advice is also to shy away from the obvious. My students come to me knowing about Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King, and I know that they're going to continue to hear about them. And so I really am going beyond that and teaching them about new people, right? Like Jim Thorpe, for example. And so, yeah, let's talk about an example of kind of going beyond a little bit more, like beyond the obvious. So I like to do my MLK, compare and contrast with Malcolm X, and that is a really historical understanding of our rights, right, and civil rights, and the struggle. And so then I like to make sure that my students understand that racism isn't over, and Colin Kaepernick is the perfect person to talk about, especially because my students love football. And so you can see here some of their answers, and they're comprehending it. So what was Colin Kaepernick's power? How did he use it? Colin Kaepernick fights for hashtag Black Lives Matter racism. He risked his career to protest racism. The other one says, kneel during the national anthem, being a famous football player. And so, my students are such smarty pants. I love that. Okay, moving on. So with implementation, I also wanted to talk about being responsive. And I mean that in two ways. The first way I mean that is that we want to be responsive to the cultures of your students in the classroom, right? But I also mean that in the way of we can't let problematic behavior slide. And so a couple of examples of me having to be flexible with my teaching was I had some giggling happening during, by just not many students, but a couple during our family unit when we were mentioning like 2 moms, 2 dads and things like that. And that didn't sit well with me. And so I ended up realizing, okay, I'm gonna do like a little bit of like an intervention, like 1 week unit. And I ended up talking about Stonewall, and I wasn't even gonna talk about Harvey Milk until his holiday that's celebrated in San Francisco in May. But I was like, well, I have to do this now because clearly my students need it. And by the end of it, my students were begging for us to continue reading Stonewall every day. They're like, Miss, are we gonna talk about that? So that was really great. And then another thing I didn't let slide that happened, and I knew I had to be responsive to it, was I had a student say something along the lines of like women not being president or can't be president or something like that. And that did not sit well with me. And so I like did research and really wanted to address that. I mean, in the moment I addressed it and I said, well, actually that's more of an American thing. There are plenty of women right now who are president and prime minister. And so I was doing some research, wanted to get some articles, and I found some awesome article on Ethiopia gets its first female president. And that was great because the student who actually made that comment was, or is Ethiopian American. And his little brain was like blown because he was just really surprised that the home country of his parents was more progressive than the United States, like when he saw that. So the last thing I really wanted to go over is in regards to implementation, really solidifying themes of solidarity and intersectionality. So I'm always talking about the themes of unity among people of color. And so that's why I really recommend this book, because it highlights that. And it taught me a lot that I didn't know. And then I wanted to talk about intersectionality. I kind of brought that up with Frida Kahlo. But it's like this idea of living in multiple worlds, right? And so I got that actually from Naomi Ortiz's book, Sustaining Spirit. And I think it's really important for students to understand that people are living in multiple worlds and experiencing different things at once. And so, right, Frida Kahlo, we talked about her intersectionality, Malcolm X being Black man in America, but also Muslim. And then another person to talk about would be George Takei, right? Because he is a Japanese American who was incarcerated in a concentration camp during World War II. And he's also a gay man. And so there are, this is actually from a News ELA article. There's lots of resources, and I just think that that's an important thing to bring up. So if you want to keep learning, this is my Instagram, and I have a Google website that I'm kind of like, I'm working on, it's in progress. And I also recommend this book right here. I think I have a more recent post about that, and I kind of put the table of contents there so it can kind of give you an idea of if you're interested in the book. So if you have any questions, I'm available here, you can see. And I just want to say thanks for listening.